Hello and welcome back to the Science of Fallout. It's me, Emmy the Cat Lady, and we are starting a new section of the Science of Fallout where we're going to talk about FEV and the supermutants and the results of FEV experimentation, both pre-war and post-war. So we need to talk about this innovation in biological warfare of FEV, which stands for Forced Evolutionary Virus. So what is FEV, where did it come from, and what does it do? So first of all, what FEV is, as described in the various kind of lore and literature around the Fallout games, is a megavirus which is capable of editing the host's DNA, and it's transmitted by direct contact or injection. It can be transmitted by aerosol spray, but it's not airborne, which means that it can't be transmitted from an infected individual just by being near them and then breathing. Essentially, it's got a very strong structure with a protein sheath that is reinforced by ionised hydrogen, which allows it to absorb neutrons without becoming radioactive. And this means that the virus is immune to radiation, so radiation can be used to help sterilise things. UV radiation it damages DNA, so you would use that to sterilise a room, especially if you are working in a lab where you're doing genetic work or you're working with DNA. That's something that's used to cleanse the lab area so that you don't contaminate your samples, but this virus is immune to that. So what about megaviruses and giant viruses? So the first megavirus genus was only described in 2010, which is obviously long after the original Fallout came out, but we have been aware of giant viruses, which are also known as gyruses. Not the most creative name, but here we are, and we have known about them since 1981. So they do have these large capsids, which are the kind of protein shells that look icosahedral, so a little bit like a sort of D10, D20, and they are 200 to 400 nanometers with a thick protein fibre coat of about 100 nanometers thick. So if you compare that to a common example being the herpes simplex virus, which is one that causes cold sores, the capsid of that virus is 100-ish nanometers in diameter, and the envelope, which is the lipid layer that some viruses have, is 150 to 200 nanometers in diameter. So these genomes are the largest known in virology, and they contain genes for the translation machinery, which is what cells use to use RNA to read DNA and make the proteins, which is previously only thought to exist in cellular organisms, which viruses are not. So viruses are not actually organisms, they're not free living, they are more like a cellular parasite, because they have to attach to a host cell and get into a host cell to actually do anything, generally speaking. And the genes of these giant viruses do also encode other genes that you wouldn't normally find in a virus, such as the genes that are responsible for glycolysis and the TCA cycle that you might know as the Krebs cycle, which is the process of how cells make energy from glucose. Also genes that are involved in the fermentation process, and also the cytoskeleton, which is parts of the inside of cells, which is a really odd thing for a virus to have genes for. And they even have genes that encode cytochrome P450 enzymes, and these enzymes are involved in a lot of different metabolic processes in multicellular organisms, including things like drug metabolism. So an example would be CYP2E1, which is involved in metabolizing the common over-the-counter painkiller paracetamol, acetaminophen for my American friends, and Tylenol, which is the brand name that you tend to get in the States. So again, it's something that's really strange for a virus to have. Why would a virus need to process drugs? And it does mean that there's kind of a suspicion that these viruses actually came about from, something else. They're very, very interesting. But the actual megaviruses weren't discovered until long after Fallout came out. So again, this was based on what we knew at the time when the game was being made. Very, very interesting. So, could viruses rewrite the genetic code? And in theory, yes, it is entirely possible. Viruses replicate themselves by basically commandeering a cell, using their genome to take over the cell's replication function and take over the process that the cell uses to copy its DNA and divide, so that it can basically make the cell produce more viruses. And it's unclear how these giant viruses have actually acquired genes that are normally found in living cells. So it does suggest that it's not impossible for it to work the other way around. And we do have the technology now to edit the genome. This was something, again, that wasn't available back in the 90s, but it is available now, and it's something that's called CRISPR. It's a very complex process the way this works, but it's derived from a mechanism that bacteria use to fend off bacteriophages. Bacteriophages are viruses that infect bacteria, and it has been harnessed in order to edit the DNA in living cells, and it has a lot of potential for treatment of genetic disorders and that kind of thing, so bone marrow problems, that sort of thing. However, there is also potential for some unethical applications of it, like making super mutants or something like that, for example. And another possibility for a virus that could change or edit the DNA of a living organism is a retrovirus. So retroviruses are viruses that have RNA inside them instead of DNA. And what they do is they basically make the cell copy and translate their RNA genome into DNA, and they insert that DNA into the host cell. So the cell basically copies all the viral DNA, transcribes it, makes proteins from it, and manufactures more viruses. So it's essentially the same process, but there's a few more steps with retroviruses because it's got RNA, so it needs to translate it into DNA first, and then the DNA is read, and that the cell makes the proteins and the various things. But because of this, retroviruses are also very prone to mutating, and they do mutate much more easily compared to DNA viruses. And some of the most important sort of public health viruses are retroviruses. So, for example, HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus that causes AIDS, is a retrovirus, as is the feline version, which is FEV, feline immunodeficiency virus, which is a virus that I spent a bit of time studying. I did 6 weeks in the lab under a PhD when I was at university, studying FEV and mutations in a particular gene in the FEV virus. So it is a subject that I do find quite interesting. But these viruses basically take over the host cell's DNA and use it for their own means. So in theory, it is entirely possible that they could, start rewriting things and changing things. So how does FEV work according to the lore that we have? So FEV basically copies DNA and stores them in exons even. That's the exons are the important parts of a gene. So they're the chains of nucleotides that sort of basically spell out the recipe for a specific protein. The introns are kind of nonsense that happens in between. So the exons are then combined into the virus's DNA, which is then injected into the host cell and merged with that cell's genetic material. And because it relies on the DNA of the individual subject, the results are not always predictable, and that's why we do see a variety of different effects of FEV on different species and in different situations. So in theory, the virus could be pre-programmed with the intended genes to correct the host genetics. So, kind of like downloading an update for a game that fixes some bugs or changes some things. That is probably the best example I've got to explain that one. And it does seem to be the effects are variable depending on the method of exposure and the dose, and how long the subject is actually exposed to the virus, as well as the way it's administered, whether it's injected or whether they're dipped in it, like we see in Fallout. That has an impact as well. So the most dramatic changes do come about from the highest dose, so like dipping them in the FEV vats, and especially for the master who spent really a long time in the FEV vat, and that's why he became the terrifying freak that he is. Because the virus doesn't actually replicate itself inside the host. But there is quite a range of effects which we will get into over the course of this new series. So, how did FEV come about? Where did it come from? So for that, we need to travel back in time a bit to 2050s in the Fallout universe. So a new infectious disease emerged, which was dubbed the New Plague. It was a major public health concern, became a pandemic, but it was also incorporated into propaganda and anti-communist sentiment by the government. And so in 2055, West Tech began working on a cure for this new plague, and they didn't actually manage to succeed, but they ended up with a lot of viral research that came in handy in 2073, when they were then contracted to develop an immunisation against the biological weapons of China. So this became the Pan-Immunity Virion Project. Pan-Immunity means it confers immunity to everything. So the early experiments did give immunity to genetic damage and damage to protein synthesis, but it also had a lot of side effects such as increased muscle mass and cell replication, and that caught the attention of the military, that they could maybe use this for improving their soldiers. And then we did see some growth and some increased intelligence in the rabbits, and then eventually the experimentation was transferred to Mariposa military base, and human experiments began. And they developed, at Mariposa, they did develop a new strain of FEV and successfully created some super soldiers that were stronger, tougher, more resistant to disease and ageing, and sometimes had an increase in intelligence, but that wasn't consistent. The experiments were kind of stopped just about the time that the bombs fell by Roger Maxson, who you may know as the original founder of the Brotherhood of Steel. So he rebelled against the scientists at Mariposa, basically executed them all, and the FEV vats were then buried until Harold set up an expedition and took Richard Gray, and they ended up there in 2102. So Richard Gray ended up falling into one of the vats and underwent a really dramatic mutation with a massive increase in his intellect, according to him anyway. But he began researching the virus, and he eventually created the first super mutants and decided that this was the next step in human evolution, and it was going to be better because the super mutants could survive better in the radioactive wasteland. So he began collecting people, especially from the vaults, because they seemed to mutate better in his eyes if they weren't exposed to a lot of radiation. So he sent out his super mutants to collect people from the vaults to build his army until the Vault Dweller put a stop to it. And that was obviously the plot of the original Fallout game. But there were other locations that had access to the virus, and they had different strains. So, for example, Dr. Merrick, who was in charge of research in Vault 87, had a version of FEV, and that created the Capital Wasteland super mutants. The Enclave also had access to it and used it for various purposes, as did the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, that went on to become the Institute, and they're largely responsible for the super mutants that are around the Commonwealth. And that's why we see the super mutants across the games, but the different strains do produce different results, and the Master and Mariposa had a different version of FEV, a different strain. compared to what was available on the East Coast. So that's why there is some fairly significant differences between the different groups of super mutants that we encounter. So what are the effects of FEV on organisms and how does it actually impact them? So we can find an FEV experiment disc in what used to be West Tech, which is located inside the Glow, which is that big radioactive crater that the Brotherhood sends you to in Fallout. I was hoping to get footage of this and of talking to the Master and things, but unfortunately I don't have a save file that's anywhere near close to the end of Fallout that I can record footage of, but I've got some screenshots from the wiki to make up for that, but that'll be more helpful when we come to talking about the Master, so I'm going to work away on getting a playthrough at that point so that we can kind of look into it and talk to the Master about all the different things, because I think that's going to be really interesting. But we do have this experiment disc which lists the progression of their experimentation with the FEV virus and the effects that they saw. And the experiments, which is fairly typical of this kind of study and this kind of research, that you'll start with the least complex organisms, so single cell organisms, and then you work your way up in terms of how complex the organisms are before you get anywhere close to human testing for things. So the earliest experiments started in single cell organisms, which would be things like bacteria, amoeba, that kind of thing, and what they showed was immunity to infection and radiation, but their metabolism was largely unchanged. There was no appreciable effect on chloroplasts, which are the organelles inside plant cells that are responsible for photosynthesis. So then they progressed to flatworms, and they showed a 28% increase in size and resistance to 39 different viruses. So the new DNA structure that was created by the FEV virus was shown to be able to be passed on to their offspring of the worms, but they only reproduced via asexual reproduction, so they weren't able to use sexual reproduction. Experiments with insects were a lot less successful. They didn't really see much in terms of results from that, but then they did move on to vertebrates. So they started with mice, and the mice showed a 31% increase in size, and specifically they noticed it with striated muscle, which is your skeletal muscle, so all the muscles that move your bones and your joints and things, that's all striated muscle, and also organs like the liver, the heart and the kidneys showed enlargement as well. There was also indications of potentially increased intelligence in the infected mice, that they were running the mazes much faster than the control group mice could do. So there was some indication at that point that the virus was potentially having an impact on intelligence levels, which is an interesting thing to note. So then they went up to a slightly bigger animal and they did some more testing with rabbits. So rabbits, they did EEGs, and they basically noticed that there was increased electrical activity within the brain very quickly after the injection of the virus, actually. And there was also the typical increase in size of the animal, which, you know, we've seen kind of across the board so far. But there was also increased connections between the neurons in the brain, which particularly was the limbic system and the frontal cortex. So these parts of the brain are responsible for things like emotions, behaviours, social behaviours, decision making and all that kind of thing. But there was also noted that there was increased aggression and posturing and sort of threatening behaviour from the rabbits, which you might be thinking rabbits are cute and fluffy, why? But if you've never encountered an aggressive rabbit, they don't hold back. They thump their feet when they're angry. They will lunge, they will bite, they'll kick. Handling an aggressive rabbit is not as easy as you might think. Not quite in the same level as Monty Python and the Holy Grail, but I have dealt with some angry rabbits before, and it's a little bit scary, I'm not going to lie. So, that was something that was noted, is that there was increased aggressive behaviour. Again, when we look at the super mutants, that isn't a huge surprise, because a lot of them do seem to be prone to, being easy to anger. Even if they are reasonable and not hostile towards you, they can turn on you very easily. So it kind of makes sense. And then they moved up to raccoons and then dogs, and largely things were kind of the same as what they'd seen with the rabbits, that they were bigger, more resistant to disease and things, but having an increased an aggressive behaviour and that kind of thing. And I think with the raccoons there was improvement in manual dexterity. So raccoons, as you probably know, they do have opposable thumbs, so they can use their hands a lot like we can. So there was a bit of improvement in that with the FEV and the raccoons as well, which is an interesting thing. And then we move up to primates, which are obviously kind of close to humans because we are also primates. So they started some testing in chimpanzees and saw quite significant increases in growth and in immunity. They even tried to induce cancer in the chimpanzees and couldn't. So there was resistance to the kind of things that you'd expect to cause cancer, i.e. radiation. But again, increased aggression. And chimpanzees, again, if you don't know, they can be quite aggressive, and if they are aggressive they can be quite dangerous. So they did see this, and they ended up having to basically kill most of the chimps that they infected. They did have 2 subjects that had really violent seizures and died because of it as well. So as you get to the more intelligent, more complex animals, things do seem to be a bit more drastic. But after this point, the research was moved to Mariposa because they wanted to start human testing, but the scientist in charge of it at the time really was against the idea of bringing human testing into it. He didn't think that it was ready for that. So they moved it to Mariposa and they began the human experiments, and then they eventually had some results, which we will get into next week. So we're going to talk about the results at Mariposa, what happened, what they found, and then what Richard Gray, the master, found when he arrived, and the FEV2 strain, what he learned about it, what he used it for, the creation of the first generation super mutants, and the other things that he actually did with the virus, because he didn't just create super mutants, he did create a few other things as well, which I think will be quite interesting. So that's how FEV works, or in theory how it would work, potentially what happened, what the results were, and the entire background for how and why FEV exists in the first place. That it started out as a way of combating biological warfare, and then it became a way for them to try and make some super soldiers, because at that point in history the military and the government were really desperate to try whatever they could in order to end this war with China. So, same as that there was research into the mini-nuke launchers, the power armour, trying to reverse engineer the stealth suits, all that kind of stuff. So they were really just trying to do whatever they could to find a way to put an end to the war. So that's the reason that came about. Hopefully you find this interesting. Any questions, any thoughts, leave them in the comments. I always love to chat about these things. Viruses are quite fascinating because of how they work, and that they're an infectious agent, but they're not an organism in their own right. They're DNA or RNA wrapped up in protein, and sometimes wrapped up in a lipid sort of envelope thing, to protect them from the environment. And the way they work is really, really quite interesting. So hopefully you found that interesting, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.